I want to read to you a passage from the book of Luke, chapter 14. We're going to begin at the 16th verse. It's the text we looked at last week, and we'll look at it again next week as well. Luke, chapter 14, beginning at verse 16. Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but still there is room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out into the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" Put your mind back 65 years ago. That's hard even for me because I was like 2 days old or something like that. Anyway, if you were a core member of Central Presbyterian Church, the pastor might invite you to come with him and go and knock on doors of the neighborhoods around here to tell them about Central. Now, even then, that took a lot of guts. But it was a little more a normal thing. You know, there were door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen in those days. There was the Fuller Brush man. And there were people going door-to-door from other churches talking about their church. It's a little different now. We've got neighborhoods that have been deliberately planned without sidewalks. And our houses are far enough apart, in some places you need a bike to go from house to house. And we don't like people coming to our doors. Maybe we never did, but now we really don't like it. We don't want somebody knocking on the door. We don't want somebody calling if we don't know them already. Isn't that an aggravation? You know, on our home phone, except for our daughter-in-law, every call that comes on that number is from somebody we don't know that's trying to sell us something. We don't like that. We don't want spam in our email, and we just don't like sales pitches. Now, that doesn't mean we don't like hearing other people's opinions. We go to Yelp when it's time to go to a new restaurant. We go to Rotten Tomatoes to find out about movies. We value what people have experienced, and we want to hear their opinions. We just don't want it forced on us. We want something real. We want something that comes from the heart, and we want something that we can trust. The passage we read today is the theme of our sermons for 3 weeks. And last week we focused on the man who was hosting the banquet. When people brought lame excuses as to why they weren't going to come, he didn't cancel the event. He changed his approach. He sent his servant out again to invite a different group of people, different ways. He was relentless. His house would be full. And what Jesus wants us to understand from that is that God's love is relentless. He won't let our inattention, he won't let our prejudices, he won't let our lame excuses stand in the way of getting out his message of forgiveness to the world. This week we're going to focus on how he changed his approach. Originally, the word went out to his normal friends and social contacts. But once they refused his generosity and hospitality, he says this in verse 21, in the second half of that verse. "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." There's a number of things I want you to notice in that verse. The first thing is that he sent them out. The servant was sent out to seek people to join the party. For the past 20 years, it's been real popular for churches to talk about seeker-friendly services. The seeker was understood to be a person who is not yet a Christ follower. A person who is hungry for something in their lives and who kind of felt like maybe a church is a good place to ask those sorts of questions. And that's a wonderful focus of the church, to be a place that's hospitable towards people who are asking questions. How we can be clear in our communication. How we can be loving in relationships. How we can be helpful in various parts of the life of the church so that people who are new to this thing and are new to asking these sorts of spiritual questions can feel at home and safe while they're asking those questions. It's great stuff, but it's not the seeker in this passage. It's not what seeker means in the life of Jesus. In this passage, the seeker, the one who seeks, is the servant. The master sends the servant to go out into the streets and alleys of the town to find people to invite. Jesus viewed himself as the seeker. For the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. From the very start of things, God's way of sending out the invitation is to send people to do it, never, ever to wait for people to come. So the first thing we need to see here is that the God figure in this parable sends his servant to seek. The second thing I want us to look at is who they were sent to seek. It's the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. These were people who in that culture and at that time had a stigma on their lives because of their disability. Most were beggars and couldn't hold regular jobs. And some people that thought that they must have done something to deserve their disability. And these would never, ever be the people invited to a highbrow party like the one that's described here. The host is telling his servant to go out and invite the very people that no one would ever expect to be invited. So your question, who is it that you would never, ever expect to be invited? Invited into God's kingdom, invited into God's forgiveness. Certainly, I think we have to take seriously the kind of list that's here in the story. There are so many physical and programmatic ways that the life of the church stands in the way of people with disabilities, and we've got to be aware of that, and we've got to address those things. And then maybe we need to think about gang members and drug users and people who are incarcerated. All those sorts of people present special problems, special challenges in us sharing the gospel. But what about in our neighborhoods? What about our network of friends? Who is it that you wouldn't expect to respond to an invitation from Jesus? Were you ever a person that someone else would expect would never respond? Who is it we wouldn't even think of sharing with when it comes to things about God because we just don't think they have any spiritual interest at all? Most of the structure in American church life is designed for the 40% of Americans who are already in church or who are open to church. Yet nearly 60% of Americans right now feel mistrustful of the institutional church, even if they view themselves as Christian or spiritual. You know people like this. Maybe you are a person like this and somebody's just dragged you here. So why should we compete with other churches for the 40%? How do we effectively reach the 60%? Because right now, they also would be among the uninvited. Ever since we built the concourse that's out there, which was built before this worship center, ever since we built that, our focus has been outside of these walls, beyond these walls. You can even see it on the cornerstone of the concourse. All the years I've been a pastor here, our focus, we've been emphasizing engagement with the community around us. And you know, that hasn't all been good. Sometimes we haven't given enough honor to the people who serve inside the church. The Sunday school teachers, the ushers, the worship leaders, the choir, the deacons, the elders, the greeters, the security people, the tech folks. All of these people who make sure we have a spiritual experience that helps draw us closer to God, to move us towards Christ, and to take care of our children, keep them safe. We've also had some good engagement with our neighbors outside of the church. Many people have gone out into the neighborhoods, into their school systems, into their workplaces, trying to be a Christian influence there. But they've gone as individuals to represent Christ. And progress is slow in relationships with people. We're busy, so it just seems to take years before we get deep, years before we get real with people. And then, even when we do, we find that maybe they're tolerant about our spirituality, but they're not interested at all. When we're in a journey like that, who's there to encourage us? Who's there to stand with us? Who's there to pray with us? For far too many of us, we've been alone. One of the blind spots we've had for about 20 years is that we've thought about interacting with the world around us much through the lens of the actions of a solitary individual. We thought of individuals volunteering with our partners. We thought of it as individuals interacting with their neighbors. We thought of it as individuals praying for and sharing with their friends. And that's good as far as it goes. At the same time, we've had this individual focus there. We've had all kinds of groups in the church. We gather in a large group for worship. We've had classes. We have small groups. But most of those gatherings are of people who have already made a decision to follow Jesus, or at least have some kind of active hunger, and they feel comfortable there. We as a church don't really often encourage times that we interact together in larger groups that involve our Christian friends, but also neighbors, family, friends who don't yet obviously have any spiritual interest. We don't encourage those sorts of mixings very often. And so we go out alone, and then when we do gather with other Christians, it almost seems to exclude other people. It's unintentional, but it's real. And if it's not the case in your life, praise God. So we need to wrestle with that pattern. And when we look at this story, even though the servant is singular, the servant represents the prophets and the apostles. It represents all the servants of God. It represents the church. Jesus' own strategy when he sent out people, he sent them out 2 by 2. In the early church, often when a church got established, it was established around an extended household. The core of a particular church would be the family members, the servants, the business partners, the nearby neighbors of a particular family. And that would become the nucleus of worship and of prayer and of service and of sharing this news about Jesus. Now, we can't roll it back and live like we did 2,000 years ago. The TV, cars, Facebook, Instagram, all that's changed things. But how can we love our community around us Love our family and our neighbors. Love our workmates. Love our local schools. Love our local businesses. And do it together. And not just as isolated individuals. Now, at this point in the sermon, you should expect that this is where I present a clear and airtight solution to this problem. And I just don't have it. So we could end the sermon right now, but I'm a preacher, so we won't. This is new territory for us. We're going to have to learn this together. Some of you are ahead of the rest of us in understanding the dynamics of this, and we're going to need to learn together. What does it mean to be one church with the buildings and the solid programs, the great summer trips, the exciting summer Bible camp, money to support missionaries, volunteers to send out into the region around us, and yet still be a church that somehow knows how to gather, to love on, and serve the people who are closest to us? To do it together. How do we do that? Now, some of you are asking the question, why even bother? Can't we just do what we do on Sunday, gather in our small groups? Isn't that good enough? I'll give you the short answer to that. No. Why? Because in the story, the host gives new directions. For my parents, it was enough that when they got to know a neighbor and figured out, hey, these are all people above, good citizens, it wouldn't be unusual for somebody in that relationship to invite the other person to go to their church. Now, you might say no, but the invitation itself wasn't totally weird. Today's different. Today, some of the people we know and love feel like being a good citizen and being a member of the church might be opposites. When you let somebody know you're a Christian, they think, oh, you're one of those people who are against gay people. Why don't you like immigrants? Well, how have you tolerated child abuse in the church for decades? Your pastors have hidden lives where they're cheating on their spouses. You're a bunch of hypocrites. Trust is gone. All the noise of our news feeds, our TVs, our social media have made it difficult for us to make clear who we are over against these negative stereotypes. It's a different world. And so if we rely on just having a good website, a few solid programs, and an occasional personal invitation, our ministry as a church will only get smaller and smaller. And our impact for Jesus will be smaller. Some of the best Christian scholars out there predict that by 2050, there will be no denominations of any size left in the United States. Many of the church buildings will still be there. But like it is in Europe now, some of those churches are going to be restaurants. In New Orleans, there was a church on Canal Street that was an operating, thriving church when I was young. It's now a restaurant. Some of them are big enough that they become condominiums. And some of them are empty shells waiting to be torn down. When that day comes, if it comes, who then will be Jesus' hands and feet? Who then will be loving our community with God's love? Who then will be sharing the good news about Jesus? In this story, the host changes his approach. He gives his servant a new set of directions. And I believe that this is a point in the life of Central Presbyterian Church where God is giving us some new directions. It's not a matter of stopping what we do here on Sunday. It's a matter of using the strength of what we do here to create an atmosphere of creativity and prayerful expectation for people to go out and ask the question of what What is God leading us to change in the other 6 days of our lives so that we can be his people wherever he's sent us? And somehow to sustain it, we're going to need others. We can't do it individually. We'll need groups of 12 or 20 or even more somehow to support each other, to pray for each other. One church base with many gatherings where we declare Jesus and demonstrate his love out there where our neighbors are. So part of what we're going to be doing this fall is trying out what it means to gather together, to get to know each other, and to pray, but to do it out there and not just here in the church. Not just our small groups, but maybe together with other small groups, or maybe together with some people who aren't in small groups, but live in the same part of town. So listen for opportunities as we present them across the fall. And if you have any ideas on how to do this, share them. We need your help. We need to own emotionally and spiritually the territory where God has placed us. If you are not being a priest, if you're not being an ambassador where you are, who is? We need to hold the needs we see before God. We need to cry out to God to meet the needs of the people we see around us, even if they're middle class, even if they're successful. In this passage, the servants sent out to the blind, the lame, the beggars. And that might not seem to apply to our neighborhoods because they seem to have it all together. But we know better, don't we? We know that behind that there are the addictions, the depression, the broken marriages. They surround us. They're in us. And we need to care enough to join in their struggles as they struggle to do something about it. In other words, we need to take seriously one of our questions of the year. One of our questions is, how am I blessing my neighbors? And maybe a better way to ask it is, how are we together blessing our neighbors? What will it look like? It's going to look different ways in different places. There's no formula here. We did an event last year focusing in on grief. It really touched a note because we all struggle with things that bring grief into our lives. It's universal, and we need help coping with it. What would it look like to do it again, but this time do it out in a community hall in one of our neighborhoods, because our neighborhoods and the people there have said, this is what we need. Maybe it means noticing people we've never noticed before. Someone in WOW went out and went to the police precinct and handed out invitations to WOW for the women who serve on the police force there. What an amazing insight to do something like that. To notice people we haven't noticed before. To notice the uninvited. And maybe God will put them on our heart and we can pray for them as well. We don't have to look far to find real things that we should look at doing or at least talking about with our neighbors. Because our neighbors have needs that are, hear this, just like ours. We are the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame spiritually too. Long before anything else happens, we hear the message of Jesus in our weaknesses. Out of our own struggles, out of our own weakness, maybe we can serve other people.